All right. In this video, I want to talk about how Egypt represents the world that was and the world to come. You may be asking what I'm talking about, and I hope you are. Egypt represents how the world was before the flood. And Egypt also represents how the world is going to be when the New World Order is set up. You may be saying, how so? And I hope you are, because that's what I'm going to explain in this video. Now, the reason why I have this picture up here is because I wanted to show you how Egypt looked at their gods, right? Where we have one here that looks like a human woman. We have one that looks like a cat, one that looks like some eagle, a hawk, looks like a serpent, but also with feathers. Here's a dog. And you're probably familiar with this, where there's Egyptian gods with like a fish head or a alligator head or a frog head and what have you. And this is interesting because the scriptures talk about certain class of angels, the cherubim, and they had four faces, where they had the face of a man, the face of an ox, the face of an eagle, and the face of a lion on each side of their head. And these beings that we see here are fallen angels. These are the actual gods that Egypt worshipped, fallen angels. And I'm going to explain this as I go through here. Now, I started off by actually reading in Amos this morning, and it was talking about the flood of Egypt. The flood of Egypt. And I was like, what is it talking about, the flood of Egypt? So I did a little bit of looking, and I came over here, and at Joshua 24, verse 14, it says, Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood and in Egypt, and serve ye the Lord. So you see here that before the flood they were serving these other gods, which their fathers served. And their fathers served them in Egypt. So here it shows us that in Egypt, they were serving the same gods that existed before the flood. Right? We see the connection here. So when I was reading this here, in Amos chapter 8, verse 8, it says, Shall not the land tremble for this, and every one mourn that dwelleth therein? And it shall rise up wholly as a flood, and it shall be cast out and drowned as by the flood of Egypt. And I was thinking, what is this flood of Egypt? Because the first thing that comes to mind is the Red Sea crossing, but that wasn't a flood, right? So that's kind of interesting. Like, what is this flood of Egypt? And then over here in Amos 9, verse 5, it says, And the Lord God of hosts is he that toucheth the land, and it shall melt, and all that dwell therein shall mourn, and it shall rise up wholly like a flood, and shall be drowned, as by the flood of Egypt. You see that? All that dwell therein shall mourn, and it shall rise up wholly like a flood, and shall be drowned. Right? The whole land, as by the flood of Egypt. So it's making this connection of the flood of Egypt as the whole earth being drowned. So I was starting to see how all this comes together, that Egypt is a representation of how the world was before the flood. And Egypt is a depiction of the world as a whole. as we can see in Genesis. Just talk about that real quick. In Genesis, we actually read about how Joseph was sold into slavery and became an Egyptian slave, and then ended up working his way up and became second in command of Egypt, which would be over the world, right? And then while in Egypt, Joseph prepared for a 7-year famine by storing up grain for 7 years of plenty. And then Israel had to come into Egypt, right? They had to come to the world to get fed. This is a depiction of what's to come, right? And it's, again, Egypt representing the world. Israel's going to have to go to the world during this time of famine, this 7-year period of Jacob's trouble, right? And it doesn't recognize that Joseph is one of them, the brother that they sold, right? Because Israel sold out Jesus to the Romans to be killed, right? And then Jesus became ruler of the Gentiles, right? Over the world, here represented by Egypt, right? And then Israel is enslaved later on by Egypt, and they're stuck in there for 400 or so years. And then God comes and uses Moses to take Israel out of Egypt, or as we have seen in 1948, God took Israel out of the world and brought them to Israel, the nation, the land of Israel. So we see how Egypt is a representation of the world, right? So I was talking about the flood of Egypt. It's the flood of the world and the flood of this Gentile system here. As if you look at the whole world, they basically worship all these different gods. Just Egypt had them all, right? And we see other nations basically did the same thing with different names, where you look at the Grecian Empire, they had all the different gods and they had them with certain names, and then the Romans took them and gave them certain names. Like I think it was the Greeks that used the planets, the names of the planets, and the planets at one point were wandering stars. And in Revelation, we learn that the stars represent angels. So we see this connection, right? The Egyptian, fallen angels, the stars, the wandering stars, the planets, given names that are worshipped, right? And there's nothing new under the sun, right? So, continuing with this thought here, in Matthew 24, verse 38, you can also read this, I believe, in Mark and in Luke, where Jesus warns of this, saying at verse 38 here of Matthew 24, excuse me, for as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark. Right? He says, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Right? For as in the days of Noah. So, what does this have to do with it? Well, we know how that before the flood, it was like Egypt. They had those different gods, but they were actually fallen angels, and they're depicted as chimeras, part human, part animal, right? And we start to see that picture being painted, such as right here in Jude. At verse 5 it says, I will therefore put you in remembrance, though ye once knew this, how that the Lord, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed them that believed not. And the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness, onto the judgment of the great day. So before I continue, we see how the angels left their first estate, right? They became fallen angels. And we got a connection with Egypt, right? Destroyed them that believed not. This has many different references, such as those who believed, Noah and his family, were taken out of the world, and those that believed not, because they didn't help with the ark and come into the ark, were destroyed. In the same manner that Israel was protected in the land of Egypt while plagues were going on, and then they were taken out of Egypt, and then the Red Sea swallowed up the Egyptian army. And then, as it talks about here, Israel going through the wilderness, those that believe not died off. And now we get an idea of what the angels did by reading verse 7. It says, even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them in like manner. So you see, Sodom and Gomorrah did in like manner of these angels that fell, right? They're put in these chains of everlasting darkness. And in like manner, Sodom and Gomorrah, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, are set for an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. So we see here that Sodom and Gomorrah did the same thing that the fallen angels did. What happened right before Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed? A couple of angels came to visit Lot, and the people wanted to mingle with those angels, right? And that's going after strange flesh, and they're set for an example of what's going to happen to these fallen angels that left their own estate and went after strange flesh. You see, Peter makes mention of this in 2 Peter chapter 2 at verse 5. And spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. Right? And he also makes a connection to Sodom and Gomorrah with this, right, where he talks about the angels being enchained. So we see a connection to what Jude said here in Peter, what Peter said here and there in Jude. Fallen angels being imprisoned, there being a flood, Sodom and Gomorrah being examples of this damnation, and they doing the same sins, right? Because that's exactly what we see taught to us in Genesis chapter 6. We check out verses 1 through 4 here. It says, and it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair. And they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, my spear shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which are of old, men of renown. So here we see the sons of God saw the daughters of men. So we see just from this passage alone that the sons of God are different from mankind. In the Old Testament, only the angels were the sons of God. Adam was made as a son of God, and he fell. And all of mankind then had to be reborn to become a son of God, like we read in the New Testament, where we as Christians have the opportunity by believing the gospel to become sons of God, where we become part of this spiritual kingdom that the angels are part of. As we see here in the Old Testament, such as in Job, where it talks about the sons of God came before God, and so did Satan, showing that Satan is not considered a son of God, but he showed up as if he was anyway, right? So we see that these sons of God are the angels. The angels fell, they took the daughters of men, they had children by them, and they were men of renown. And not only did they have children with women, like it says here, before the flood and also after the flood, but we see here at verse 12, and God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. Right? They were mingling with the different animals. But we see here that the reason why Noah was saved is he found grace. Grace is unearned and undeserved. So why was Noah saved? He was just man and perfect in his generations. That's not saying he was perfect in his generation, saying he's perfect in his genealogy. He wasn't tainted by this mixing, this corruption that was going on. He's taken out of the world into the ark in the same manner that Lot was taken out of Sodom, that was doing things in like manner, right? They were going after strange flesh, corrupting the flesh by trying to go after these angels, and in Noah's time, these fallen angels. These angels were enchained, as we read from Peter and Jude, and they're going to face the fire that Sodom and Gomorrah faced. So we see so far, making this connection, that Egypt had to do with these fallen angels mingling with the seed of man, and they were mixing genetics so that you had these chimeras, these half man, half animals. And that's how it was before the flood, and Egypt is a representation of how it was before the flood, and it's exactly how it's going to be at the end, as Jesus warned us that at his coming, it was going to be like in the days of Noah. So it's going to be an Egypt rising. And before I get into Revelation to talk more about this, I want to show some pictures here. There is a certain Egyptian god called Kek, who is a frog-like being, amphibian reptoid creature. And there's connection to this fella here, Kek, and the world today, where I would recommend the videos from YouTube user Probably Alexandria, and she talks about this Kek and this connection with Donald Trump and 4chan and QAnon, where they're all using Egyptian meme magic with Kek to promote Donald Trump. It's very interesting stuff, very detailed stuff, but we can see that there's still this connection. And you have America with the pyramid on the $1 bill with the new world order, the Novus Ordo Seclorum on it. So we see this, again, a tie with the New World Order and Egypt. And while I was looking at pictures to put up here, this is supposed to be another depiction of Kek, and it has these Egyptian hieroglyphs here. And this one here I thought was interesting because it looked like the spiral of DNA. It has a little notch here cut out. I don't know if that's intentional or if that's just because of age. But I was like, hey, that's kind of interesting, because what was going on in the days of Noah? What is it going to be like when Jesus returns? Well, there's the mixing. there's going to be this mixing of genetics, fallen angels with man and with animals. Well, it's going to be like this, right? And we see two things connected to this right now. There's a lot of things with genetics and changing genetics, messing with the DNA and RNA, even with certain snake bites that you would take to mess with your RNA because you don't want to get ill or worried about getting ill, right? And we're also seeing a huge influx of people reporting UFOs, or what are they calling them? UAPs now? So instead of unidentified flying objects, they're unidentified aerial phenomenon. Because sometimes it's not like it's a flying object, there's something weird going on in the sky. So I guess that's why they're calling them UAPs. But part of the deception that's going to come when the rapture happens is aliens showing up, right? But they're not aliens. And even though they're going to claim to have taken the people who are raptured, it's a lie. They're fallen angels. And they couldn't show up until the church was out of the way, because the church actually has power over these beings, such as people who have experienced these things with alien abduction, sleep paralysis, and these demonic activities that people have connected to be very similar, as if they're the same thing. That these people who experience these things call on Jesus for help, and these beings flee from it. These events stop, whether they're having this poltergeist activity, whether they're having sleep paralysis, or whether they're dealing with abductions, where people talk about them taking sperm or eggs from them. There's stories of women getting abducted. Next thing they know, they're pregnant. Then they have another abduction experience, and all of a sudden the baby is gone. And they've reported the pregnancy, and all of a sudden the child's gone and all that, and they don't really think anything of it. I mean, other than, hey, what happened to the child? But they didn't think anything of these abductions. Like, they think there's making up stories, but when the child is just gone, well then, hey, then there's something going on there, right? So what I'm actually going to do right here is pause for a second, because I got someone coming up to the door, and it'll just be a little click. Okay, so continuing with this here, talking about these alien abductions and what have you. Once this rapture happens, these fallen angels are going to show up claiming to be aliens, and it's going to reestablish the Egyptian pantheon. And we're going to see it's going to be like in the days of Noah, where the fallen angels are coming, and they're going to be mingling with the seed of man. Just like we actually read in Daniel. Daniel actually warns of this. I forgot to bring this one up. In Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar is given a dream that depicts the history of the world until Jesus returns. And Daniel tells him the interpretation of this. And he tells him here, verse 35, "Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken in pieces, and became like chaff of the summer threshing floor, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth." So we see this depiction of this statue is a depiction of time, starting with Nebuchadnezzar as the head of gold, then becoming the chest of arms of silver, the belly and thighs of brass, the legs of iron, and then finally the feet of iron and clay. And that is when Jesus returns, the rock that's cut without hands, smashes the statue at the feet and destroys it. and establishes the millennial kingdom. And what it says about the iron and the clay, the end of the world here, it's like the days of Noah. It says here in Daniel chapter 2 at verse 43, "And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. They shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay." So you see what we've read in Genesis about the sons of God mingled with the daughters of men. Here it says, "They shall mingle themselves with the seed of men." So not only will they be mixing with the women, but with the men, because this is probably going to be some kind of snake bite that is going to be the mark of the beast, that's going to change you genetically. It's going to genetically alter you so that you're mingled with them. That's why the people who take the mark of the beast cannot be saved. They are damned. They are becoming, instead of the sons of God, they are declaring they're becoming the sons of Satan. That's why these people who are preaching, oh, maybe you could take the mark and cut your hand off and what have you. No, they're subtly leading you to damnation, because once you've taken it, it's part of you. It's going to change you and what you are. So don't take it. If you want to save your soul, you're going to have to suffer and die if you miss the rapture. Right? You thought all this stuff was a joke. You thought it was silly, foolish. Well, now you're in this mess. Now you're going to suffer and die so that you don't lose your soul and be damned. So, with that being said, coming over here to Revelation, we read, you know what, I'm going to come back to this part a second. In Revelation 11, at verse 8, it says, "And their dead bodies shall lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt." Again, connecting Sodom and Egypt with this mixing, right? Where also the Lord was crucified. So we see that Jerusalem is going to be spiritually called Sodom and Egypt. And Jerusalem is actually going to be the headquarters of the New World Order. Because the false Christ, the Antichrist, the beast, is going to pretend that he's the Messiah. And in order to live that out, he has to come and fulfill the prophecies of establishing Israel as the head of the nations. So that's what he's going to come do. At that first seal, when the Antichrist is revealed, he goes forth conquering and to conquer. And he does it as if he is the Messiah, Jesus. And he's going to fool a lot of people. So, with that being said, when we come over here to Revelation chapter 17, we're being told about this beast. And this beast has to do with the nation of Israel. And it says something interesting here. It says, "The beast that thou sawest," here at verse 8, now highlighted here, "the beast that thou sawest was, and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit, and go into perdition." So this is interesting, because the beast with the deadly wound, it was, it is not, it shall ascend out of the bottomless pit. And it goes into perdition. Very key words being used here. The bottomless pit has a connection to the abyss. And the abyss actually has to do with the ocean. Deep into the ocean is the abyss, right? And it was known as the bottomless pit because nobody went down there. And still today, we haven't gone all the way down. So it's just depicted as a bottomless pit. And I do think this also has a spiritual condemnation, but in the physical realm, we see the bottomless pit as the abyss of the ocean. And this beast that thou sawest was, and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit. So it ascends out of the abyss, just like we read in Revelation chapter 13, I believe it is, where the beast comes up out of the sea. And as it says here, it ascends out of the bottomless pit, and the beast comes up out of the sea. We see this connection with the bottomless pit and the abyss. And what beast that had to do with Israel actually was destroyed into the sea, into the abyss? Well, before I actually get into that, let's read the part I have highlighted here. It says here at verse 9, the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth, and there are 7 kings. 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition. Now, these kingdoms have to do with the kingdoms that had to do with Israel, like what we read in Daniel. Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7, we read about the kingdoms that have to do with Israel, right? And so people talk about this. Who are these 7 kings and kingdoms? Well, the first one that had to deal with Israel was Egypt, right? They went into Egypt, and then they became captive by Egypt. Then who would they have to deal with? Assyria, or modern day Samaria. Then who would they have to deal with after that? Well, number 3 would be Babylon. Who would be number 4 then? Well, who ended up taking over after that, dealing with Israel? Medo-Persia. And then who came after Medo-Persia and was dealing with Israel? Well, the 5th one is Greece. So we see from this point of view, the 5 that are fallen are Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. And it says 1 is, who came after Greece? The one that is right now while John is writing this. Rome. He says the other is not yet come, and when he cometh, he must continue a short space. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition. So this beast out of the 7 here went into the bottomless pit and is revived. Now, who is the 7th that continues a short space? Well, Rome is still actually in existence. It's just not in its power that it once had, and still actually has a huge influence over the world through Catholicism and Roman law, mercantile law, the law of the sea. And it has everybody in subjection because of the world's reserve currency of the US dollar. So we see that this one that has come for a short space gives us some kind of looking into, right? Because it says a short space. So what is a short space? Well, it has to be shorter than any one of these kingdoms existed, right? So shorter than, I guess, 500 years or so? So who would this 7th kingdom be that has an influence over Israel? Maybe it's actually Israel itself. Maybe America. America isn't that long, and it looks like it's going to fall. And Israel, it's not even 80 years old yet. And we just read from Revelation 11 that Jerusalem is spiritually called Sodom and Egypt. So we see that this kingdom that is up right now, Israel, Maybe it's going to continue for a short space. Then the rapture happens. We have the Ezekiel 38-39 war where people come against Israel, and it actually becomes a world war. That's where Israel then is established as the head of the nations, and that is the eighth. That's the eighth. That's actually of the seven. It's of the seven, as we see the feet in Daniel is made of iron and clay. It's a mixture, right? We see that Roman iron mixed with clay. The clay represents Israel. Isaiah and Jeremiah let us know that Israel is like clay in the hands of God, right? So this eighth that's of the seven, well, he has to be the one that comes out of the bottomless pit. Now, which one of these kingdoms actually went into the bottomless pit? Well, there's only really two connections that we can actually make to this bottomless pit and going into perdition, as it talks about this seven, the eighth that's of the seven also goes into perdition. And that is Egypt. Because Egypt, as its army came after Israel, was destroyed in the flood. And Egypt also went through the plagues, and there's nothing new under the sun. What has been done will be done. Ecclesiastes 1:9. So we can see a connection of Egypt coming up out of the sea, out of the bottomless pit, as they also depict the old world before the flood, as the days of Noah, Egypt rising. And they're coming up out of the sea. The deadly wound is healed. They're of the seven, and they're the eighth, right? They're reestablished, but they're also mingled with Israel, where Jerusalem is spiritually called Sodom and Egypt, right? So I hope you can see the picture that's trying to paint here, making this connection. I made a video a while ago about it on my other channel about Egypt rising, but while looking at this flood of Egypt, just a little more detail came at me here. And it's going to be just like when Joseph was trying to get his brothers to come to him and acknowledge him. Israel is going to be in Egypt, right? Spiritually speaking, and they're going to be in the world, physically speaking. And they're going to have to come out and call on Jesus. Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord, to be rescued, right? So, yeah, I guess that's about it. I'm just trying to delay in case there's anything else that pops into my head here to bring up. Now the 10 horns, they're not the heads, obviously. These are going to be kings that are set up that probably rule over the world for the Antichrist. And as we know, this Antichrist ends up claiming to be God and the temple, showing that the third temple has to be rebuilt. And a lot of this stuff having to do with Israel and Jerusalem. We know that's the center, the focal point. That's going to be the headquarters. Yeah, I guess that's about it for this. There's Egypt rising. What? I guess I'll end actually by showing you Ecclesiastes. Let's use this one here. Let's go to it. This is something that's stuck in my head for a while. Ecclesiastes 1:9. The thing that hath been done, it is that which shall be done. And that which is done is that which shall be done. And there's no new thing under the sun. Just like Jesus says about being told the end from the beginning. Right? Genesis is the beginning, and we've been told the end from the beginning. So we got this connection with Egypt rising. That's how this New World Order is going to be. So, with all that being said, thanks for watching, and take care.